Good morning. Can everyone hear me? I don't know how close to be to this, sorry. Good morning and welcome to the 9th Annual Fair Housing Breakfast. My name is Kristen Kuran-Fuller. I'm the Associate Director of the Fair Housing Center. I really appreciated being able to greet most of you this morning and put some faces to names. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you for being a partner in the work toward fair housing for all. It is now my pleasure to introduce Fair Housing Center Board Member Delphia Simpson, Chief Public Defender for Washtenaw County. Delphia has served on our board since the year 2000. Delphia, yeah, I know you're right. Come on up. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to welcome you to our ninth Annual Fair Housing Center Breakfast. Oh, closer? Is that better? Great. So thank you all for joining us this morning. First, I would like to thank our sponsors. First, the gold sponsors are McKinley, Washtenaw County Office of Community and Economic Development, Old National Bank. Our silver sponsors are Bank of Ann Arbor, Michigan Realtors, University Bank, and Zillow. And our bronze sponsors are Ann Arbor Area Board of Realtors, Beal Properties, the Charles Reinhardt Company, Fifth Third Bank, Flagstar Bank, Independent Bank, Lombardo Homes, Michigan State Housing Development Authority, PNC Bank, and Zingerman's Community of Businesses. Thank you all for making this event possible. So please forgive me if I squint. I forgot to print this out in larger font, so I'm going to do my best. Oh, no, I'm good. So I also would like to thank our attendees who are joining us in person and on our live stream. Your belief in the Fair Housing Act and financial support of our mission to end housing discrimination and promote accessible, integrated communities is what shapes our collective future. As a longtime board member, I can attest to how vital it is for your participation in these events and for your help in spreading the word about what we do and how others can get involved. So if you haven't done so, please take this opportunity to renew your 2022 membership, or if you'd like to become a member of the Fair Housing Center, I encourage you to do so with an envelope that is at your seat or on our website. So now I have the great honor of introducing Pam Kish, the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center. So like any good leader, I scoured the internet to find information about her, and it was all about the Fair Housing Center. So I'm going to do my best. There's not a lot. But she received her BA and MSW from the University of Michigan. Prior to working on fair housing issues, Pam advocated for homeless youth at the Ozone House, coordinated a sexual assault education program while a student at Michigan, and worked on a student-led coalition against racism. So my understanding is in the 90s, Pam began the talks with interested people to develop the Fair Housing Center in Washtenaw County. And then this is our 30th anniversary this year. And Pam has led the way from the very beginning through lean times as well as prosperous times, and has also led us through with the expansion of the Fair Housing Center. So with that, please welcome Pam Kish, our Executive Director.
Thank you, Delphia. Our speaker this morning, Brian Green, is Vice President of Policy Advocacy for the National Association of Realtors, where he oversees all legislative and regulatory advocacy on behalf of the association's 1.6 million members. Are there any members here of the National Association of Realtors? Okay. Nice to see you.
Brian joined the National Association of Realtors in late 2019 and has spent his first year raising the association's profile in Washington and nationwide on all fair housing related policy matters as NAR's first director of fair housing policy. Before joining the National Association of Realtors, Brian served for 10 years as HUD Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity General Deputy Assistant Secretary. There, he pursued large-scale, high-profile cases that addressed systemic discrimination and provided widespread relief, including a $100,000 settlement on race discrimination case where Brian noted, racial discrimination in housing not only violates the law and our commonly held moral precepts as Americans, it also causes great economic and social harm to the family denied the opportunity to live in the neighborhood of their choice. While at HUD, Brian also managed the Fair Housing Assistance Program, FAP, and HUD's Fair Housing Initiatives Program, FIP, which together provide $70 million in government to government agencies and nonprofit organizations like the Fair Housing Center, we're a FIP, fighting discrimination in local communities. Brian was the 2007 recipient of the Presidential Rank Award, the highest federal honor bestowed upon federal senior executives for outstanding service. Outside his work, Brian plays guitar in a band called Suspicious Package, writes about music, history, race, and culture, contributing regularly to Smithsonian Magazine. A 2017 article that Brian wrote about the 1969 Harlem Cultural Festival led to his work as a consulting producer in the Academy Award-winning film Summer of Soul. Anybody see this, Summer of Soul? It's a great movie. He has also appeared in the publications Race and Poverty, and as well as Newsweek. Brian earned his degree in government from Harvard University, what we call here as the Michigan of the East. So please help me welcome Brian Green.
All right, there's way too much information out there on the internet about me. So it's great to be here. Great to see so many familiar fair housing faces, and glad to see realtor friends in the audience as well, and so many others. Ann Arbor, you know, I feel like coming to Ann Arbor and telling the good people here about fair housing is a little bit like bringing coals to Newcastle. I mean, you guys have long been a great progressive city, great leaders on this issue. I was telling Pam last night that I first learned about Ann Arbor when I was a kid as a Beatles fan and heard about John Lennon coming here to support John Sinclair and the movement during the 60s. Learned that you guys had a fair housing ordinance and a human relations commission going back to the 50s. So great city of great leadership. So hopefully I can tell you something that will be uplifting and further you in your efforts. I'm very impressed to learn about an organization you have here called Justice Indeed, which is fascinating because in the couple of years since the killing of George Floyd, all throughout the country, a lot of communities have been looking at their history, and they've been looking at these racially restrictive covenants from the past. And, you know, some have had just sort of a very superficial look at them, and they've said, you know, let's just get rid of them and, forget this ever happened. What I think is really important, and what I noticed that Justice Indeed is hoping to do, is to also memorialize what occurred here with these covenants, and to note that, you know, these exclusions took place everywhere, including in progressive cities like Ann Arbor. And, you know, I was reading one article about them, and I think there are some misperceptions. I mean, someone was suggesting that these deeds still continue to keep people out of communities. They don't. They were invalidated by the Supreme Court in 1948, and now today there are whole communities that are communities of color where you'll find those deeds in houses. So they don't actually prevent anyone today from living somewhere. Although when people discover them, they may take offense when they see them. But they certainly shaped our communities, and they shaped our communities nationwide. Once these patterns were set, once people were excluded from communities, then it became challenging to undo that segregation. So you had the racially restrictive covenants, then they were reinforced by state and private action that discriminated, and then you had redlining, which prized some communities and condemned others, denying them mortgage credit. You had FHA denying homeowners insurance to certain communities. And then you also had other state action like zoning, which effectively shut people out of certain communities. And I'll tell you a little bit more about zoning in a bit and what I think we should take note of. But all of these actions reinforced what these covenants did. And we at the National Association of Realtors take responsibility for these covenants too, because as soon as the Supreme Court invalidated discriminatory laws that would sort of create apartheid communities, we at the National Association of Realtors said, it looks like we can use covenants. So that set a whole chain reaction that has contributed to segregation in our country, in cities like Ann Arbor as well, and the wealth inequality that followed from that. But I also think what's important to note is, in reading about these efforts in Ann Arbor to memorialize this, we still have a lot of people who learn about these covenants and are surprised. And so the fact there's that surprise demonstrates in some way that they are effectively erased, that many people don't know this history is there. So it's really important, I say, to take on these projects to memorialize these covenants, especially if people are thinking they want to expunge them. If you memorialize them and then you decide you're going to go ahead and expunge them, I think that's fine. But I do think it's important that we never forget and that we document these things so we understand how we got to where we are. So I want to take a moment, I'm going to take you to church for a moment and tell you a little story here. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, back in 1957, there was a couple that moved to town named Percy and Lilea Harris. They were an African-American couple. I just learned this story myself recently, working with some folks in Cedar Rapids. In 1957, they moved there. They were renting a home, and they joined the St. Paul's Methodist Church there. At that time, in this affluent community of Cedar Rapids, they were the only African Americans. Percy Harris was a cardiologist, and he had done some pioneering work in his field, and was an honored member of the community. But he said that he could not get any white family to sell him a home. And they struggled for years to buy a home. They were renting. Finally, some folks at the church, and this was a pretty progressive church that had actually done a fair amount to advocate for civil rights locally, some folks at the church said, you know what, we've got property, and we're trying to raise money for our fund. Why don't we sell you some of the church property, and then you can build a home for your growing family? And so they had to put it to the church. And this literally split this progressive church. And people in the church were like, all right, well, yeah, we believe these things, but if we were to sell property here, and with us living in the community, this one black family is going to lower our property values. And so there were great debates in this church about this. And it really surprised and offended some parishioners, but others were really quite dug in. And I found this quite compelling. There was a story about a woman in the congregation who was considered very soft-spoken and somewhat frail, and she got up and she said to the congregation, "This is the issue. Are we a Christian church or not? And if we are not, then this is a good time to decide it and get it decided definitively and not go on being hypocritical about it. If the majority of this church do not believe that people are equal in the sight of God, then let's not say so to the world." I look at this congregation from a place where I stand Sunday after Sunday, and I cannot believe that this congregation will not vote for this man. There will be nothing in my life which would ever break my heart as much as to have this congregation vote no on this issue tonight. And then she continued, raising the stakes for the congregation. She said, "This is not just St. Paul's Church here tonight. This is the world. The whole world is here tonight. And this is one of the great problems of the world. And to say that the church should not be involved in facing the great problems of the world is to say that the church should not do its job. Where else should this problem be solved if not in this church?" And so ultimately, the congregation voted, and they voted 400 to 291 to sell the Harrises the land. This is a big congregation. But the story doesn't end there. Some actually left the church over this. And they formed a new church not far away. Now, I know that the Southern Baptists broke off from the Baptists in order to defend and justify slavery, but this might be the first instance, it's the only instance I know of, where a church was formed in order to maintain housing segregation in opposition to a single family moving into a community. And the new church that was formed, it still exists today. And, I went on their website because I was wondering, do they tell their origin story? And, this home purchase and this fissure in the church was 1962, 61, 62. And, I saw that the church had a video of its, on its 50th anniversary of its founding. And there were, some older church members talking about, the beginning of the church. They don't mention this story. And so I could not find the history anywhere on its website. So, I ask you, is it important that we know this history? Or should we just let bygones be bygones? I don't think it's an academic issue. I think it's critical that we know how the history has shaped us. Faulkner said, the past is not dead. It's not even past, because it affects us today. It is alive today. Today, the white homeownership rate in the United States is 72%, while the black homeownership rate is about 42%. The Hispanic homeownership rate is at 51%. The Asian homeownership rate is at about 61%. NAR is part of a collaborative called the Black Homeownership Collaborative, and we're part of that group that wants to lift up this huge gap and identify the federal solutions that we need and some local solutions that we think can actually begin to close these gaps. So it's calling attention to this 30-point gap between African Americans and whites as the most dramatic one, and one that if we can begin to close, can also help close the gaps of other groups. And, I've written about this, this gap, and I've done op-eds, and it's fascinating. They say you should never read the comments, but I end up reading the comments on these things. And, invariably, people will say things like, well, African Americans, they need to finish high school. They need to get education or whatever. Overlooking the fact that even in the same op-ed, I would point out that if you look at, who's buying homes, and we've done these research reports called Snapshot of Home Buying and Selling by Race, the typical black person who succeeds in buying a home actually has just as much education, if not more education, than the typical white person who successfully purchases a home. That was true in 2021, and actually in 2020, African Americans who bought homes tended to have master's degrees. They clustered around people with master's degrees compared to whites who had college degrees. And why is that? It's because of family wealth. It's because of generational wealth. If you don't have money, if you don't have the family wealth, you have to achieve higher incomes. So African Americans who are achieving home ownership are people who are getting more education, more than their white counterparts, in order to compensate for the lack of family wealth. And you see that in the other statistics when we look at where families are finding their down payments. So in our most recent report, we found that 38% of white Americans were finding the money for their down payment from the sale of a previous home, compared to about 21% of African Americans and 25% of Hispanics. For white Americans, only about 6% were tapping into their pensions and 401ks to find their down payment, whereas for African Americans, 14%, twice as many, were tapping into their future. Same with Hispanics, like 12%, and Asians about 10%. So folks are tapping into their future in order to get this home today because they didn't have historic wealth. And I mentioned education, that folks are going to school to get these degrees, which is good, but they're doing it, again, to compensate for the lack of generational wealth. And so African Americans are almost twice as likely to have student loan debt compared to white Americans. White Americans, about 22% have student loan debt compared to 41% of African Americans. And then African Americans have significantly more, about 50% more student loan debt. The typical debt for an African American was $45,000 compared to $30,000 for whites. And Hispanics have about $35,000 in debt too. So these are the challenges now we're facing because of all these downstream effects of exclusion. Just think if, say, the Harrises or other families who were excluded by covenants 3 generations ago, 4 generations ago, could have had a stake back then, the opportunities that they could provide. So this is a difference over generations that we're seeing today, and these complicated ways in which people are making it work, but often, taking from their future too by tapping into their 401ks and such. Now, the other complication that we're trying to address as realtors, and I know the government's also trying to address, are these allegations of appraisal bias as well, which are getting more attention. I saw there was an ABC documentary about this. That even if you are successful in purchasing a home, if we're purchasing homes in segregated communities, those homes do not appreciate at the same rates. And then some of these appraisal allegations have suggested that if you're an African American, even living in a white community, and you're trying to refinance your home, if you are home or if your pictures are there when the appraiser comes, they're alleging that they're finding their homes appraised at much lower values than others. I just saw that there was a study that just came out a couple of days ago where they did tests with interracial couples. I've never seen this before, but it's based actually on a number of news stories where interracial couples were finding that depending on which spouse was home, they were finding a 50% differential in the appraised value of the home. And so, there was a case in Jacksonville. African-American wife was home. They got a certain value that was lower than the price they were hoping to sell the home for. And then when they reordered the appraisal and her white husband was home, and they took down pictures, it was 50% higher. There was a case in Denver, comparable, African-American husband, white wife. When the African-American man was home, they got a certain value and took the comps from the community to the west. And then when they reordered the appraisal and the wife was home, they took the comps from the community to the east, which was more white, and it was a 50% difference. Same house. So these are the allegations that are out there too. And so compound that even if you achieve the prize and you have the home, but if it's in an African American community or if you're African American homeowner, you're battling that. And so these are the issues, the realtors are taking leadership on to address, working with the federal government who are looking into these issues, making sure that the marketplace is fair to all. But one of the biggest issues that we are pointing to right now is affordability as affected by housing supply. And we've been raising the alarm that the lack of housing construction in this country for the last several decades is a fair housing issue. That essentially we've, in many communities, kind of zoned ourselves out of housing supply by having overly restrictive zoning that's restricting and raising up the price of where you can build housing, especially what many people are calling the missing middle housing. Take interest rates on top of that, which are compounding affordability. Now, interest rates, I'm confident at some point will come down. But the question really is, are we willing to take the measures in this country to bring supply of housing up? When we created the suburbs, we created, in many cases, a zoning policy that would be very, very restrictive and make housing unaffordable to many new entrants, especially people of color. And that was conscious. If you've read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, he talks quite a bit about this. But if there's one figure who you may want to read up on, is this fellow named Harlan Bartholomew, who was the first urban planner to be hired by a city in this country over 100 years ago, almost 120-something years ago. And in St. Louis, he created essentially the modern zoning system, and he created it neutrally, but everywhere else, he described his interest in maintaining a structure that would exclude people of color from white communities and maintain them that way. And it is really from his early zoning, which was then adopted by many, many other cities, that we created what's considered the R1 zone, the traditional zoning for single family, that is often very exclusive. And now we're discovering in many, many communities, when we have a housing shortage, that people don't really want to let go and make variances to that zoning to provide the housing supply that we are going to need to, one, meet the population demand, but also, two, provide for more affordable housing. And when I'm using affordable housing here, I'm using it as a lowercase a, just market housing that is affordable, because through the principles of supply and demand. And so those are state and local decisions. But we at the National Association of Realtors, have been talking with the White House and been talking with legislators about different things that can be done to incentivize more steps at the state and local level to create more housing opportunity so that there is more what's called missing middle housing. This is the housing, we're talking about architectural form, not like income. Duplexes and triplexes and smaller units, that missing middle that would be affordable to have more of that housing in our communities. So, and with that supply, as I said, would come more affordability and potentially more diversity because, people of color on average have less wealth, so housing those folks could afford. And then, in addition to that, if we're making these changes throughout our communities, we can also have more diverse and inclusive communities. And there are other things we also can and should consider. The Black Homeownership Collaborative has been talking about the value of special purpose credit programs. I know we have a lot of lenders in the room. Since the 70s, Gerald Ford, your former the president from your state, he signed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which created something called special purpose credit programs, which allowed lenders to create programs to address historical exclusion in lending, that you could actually have race-based lending programs. And many lenders didn't realize they could use this or questioned whether they could or they would face a legal challenge despite it being there in federal law. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, my former employer, finally said clearly that use of these programs would not violate the Fair Housing Act, put out a legal opinion to make clear that, the 1976 amendments to COA came after the Fair Housing Act and are consistent with the Fair Housing Act. So you can create these kinds of programs. And so now more lenders are looking at that to help remedy some of these past harms. So those things are possible. There are many states and localities that are looking to create and have created down payment assistance programs, again, to address these shortages of wealth from past actions. So all of these things should be part of the mix, but I think there's no one thing that could do more than us taking a closer look at state and local zoning laws. And then, of course, we need to make sure we enforce our fair housing laws because, just from some of the situations I described, discrimination still occurs today. And I've made it clear among realtors that we need to do more than tell people, if you experience discrimination, report it, because most people don't know they're facing discrimination. That's why fair housing centers are important. That's why testing is critically important. We at the National Association of Realtors have advocated for more funding for testing because we want to be sure that those who engage in discrimination are not out there operating. We've made very clear as a trade association, we don't want people calling themselves realtors who are engaged in discrimination. So just as the American Medical Association wouldn't want quacks out there calling themselves doctors or being part of their association, we don't want people who are engaged in discrimination wearing the realtor R. That's not who we are. So we're very strong on that, and we've been advocating for more funding for fair housing enforcement, and we've been doing what we call self-testing. We've been working with associations who want to do more to help their members identify practices in their midst that need to be addressed. And this could be self-corrective. I mean, some people are maybe engaged in unconscious discrimination, and rather than have New York Newsday or the Detroit Free Press expose realtors engaged in discrimination, we have made it possible for companies to look at themselves and take corrective action. So we want to do more of that, but also support federal government efforts to enforce the fair housing laws. And so we must make sure these laws are effective and that they do what they intend to do. But I want to also stress another point, and I think this also must be remembered today, that just because we have a law doesn't mean practices go away. And Dr. King said, the majority of Americans believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play, to steady growth toward a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. Overwhelmingly, America is still struggling with irresolution and contradictions. It has been sincere and even ardent in welcoming some change, but too quickly, apathy and disinterest rise to the surface when the next logical steps are to be taken. Laws are passed in a crisis mood after a Birmingham or a Selma, and you might even say, you know, after a Minneapolis, but no substantial fervor survives the formal signing of the legislation. The recording of the law in itself is treated as the reality of the reform. So we must do more to seek justice, not just in word, but in deed. We must count not just on the laws themselves, but we must actually do better. Thank you very much.
Some questions.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Are there questions? Yes.
I'm probably going to ask you to tell me more of what you've seen. So, I mean, I'm not aware of any studies, or certainly not any studies that NAR has done. We work closely with the Manufactured Housing Institute. In fact, one of my team members went over there to work for some time. I'm kind of curious whether they have done anything. I'm not aware of what civil rights related work they've done. I can tell you that in my many years working at HUD, you know, we had some complaints involving such discrimination, some really nasty ones, where, you know, folks were not willing to rent the land. You know, usually these were homes in a park, and so some nasty ones here and there. So I'm kind of curious, is there a particular issue that you're seeing that you think there should be more attention to?
I don't know. I don't know that I can give a report in this forum.
All right.
I just.
Well, let's talk.
I see enough that makes me really wonder, and I would think that that would be a good area to expand your database.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I'm curious for your thoughts about the persisting problem in understanding disability rights in the fair housing context. And we talked about it a little bit before you spoke when the response from a realtor or from a landlord is we treat everyone equally.
Yeah.
And how that falls short. And what can you do to move beyond that fundamental problem?
Yeah, Robin and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, just how many people, you know, when they, you know, talk about fair housing, they say, well, you know, you got to treat everyone the same. And of course, disability is unique under the fair housing laws in that, in addition to, you know, the law saying you can't exhibit bias towards someone because they have a disability, it also requires that you make reasonable accommodations to rules, essentially level the playing field. There are certain situations where you have to make exceptions to rules in order to create equal opportunity. And likewise, the law calls for some reasonable modifications at individuals' expense as well, if it's necessary for the person to use a property. And so we at the National Association, I'm sorry, did someone say something? Yeah. Oh, thank you. All right, yeah, more of that. We at the National Association of Realtors just did this, what we're calling an innovative training, this interactive training. We've created this computer-based training called Fairhaven, where you are a realtor going into different transactions, and you've got to complete a certain number of transactions. But all these different things are thrown at you that could either lead to you engaging in discrimination, or you might actually witness discrimination by another realtor in the scenario, or and so you have to identify this and address the situation correctly. And in that scenario, in that training, we developed a number of disability-related scenarios. Say someone's purchasing a condo and they need a reasonable accommodation in order for them to live in that property. And so we throw those situations out at people to teach them that way. And just I'll say generally that we find that kind of training often more effective than just calling your Fair Housing Center to train or to have some course where you're getting classroom training. That's effective too, but I think to take it another level, to create these scenario-based trainings has been really helpful, and we've just been surprised by the response, people like that. And then we've also built into that some videos. And so I don't know if you guys know Fred Freiberg from the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York, but he's done a number of videos on housing discrimination. And so we will intersperse these different videos and scenarios. And we also have sexual orientation in there too, which is not covered under the federal law. Well, in a way it is covered under the federal law, in that we're interpreting gender discrimination to apply to sexual orientation and gender identity now, following a Supreme Court case in employment. But we were ahead of the game, and when we created this, it was before that Supreme Court decision, and because our code of ethics say you have to provide equal professional service regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity, we have those scenarios in it as well. So it's been very popular, and we hope to kind of build it out, and we're adding more videos as we learn about interesting new cases, some cases in Michigan maybe, and so so that's become a place where we're doing more disability-related training. There's a fellow a realtor who does a podcast just on disability rights issues, and I've participated in his podcast, and we've been talking about different things we can do to expand knowledge on that. I can't tell you the guy's name offhand, but yeah.
Good morning, Dave Montfort, Reinhardt Realtors.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for coming. I got a comment and a question.
Yeah.
First, a comment.
Yeah.
Great to see the National Association of Realtors at least recognize the issue through your office. And I remind realtors not to stand pat about what your local and particularly state associations are doing with their lobbying efforts, because there's certain quote-unquote economic issues the state association has lobbied for that I think are completely contrary to housing production and allowing more people to buy houses, and based essentially because of expense. And we know who that burden primarily falls upon. Mm-hmm. The question is, construction financing and the lack of government involvement or subsidizing it, it seems to be that has fallen away. I grew up in an era where we'd see, in the 60s and 70s, where we'd see developers put up 300 homes at a time. We don't see that much anymore. And an area like Ann Arbor with pretty high land prices, we see these developments with relatively small lots, 3 sales at a time, build up as high and as big as you can. And I'm just curious if there's efforts through the administration or in Congress to really return to, the government, the federal government, helping subsidize affordable housing production. You don't see a 1,200-foot house being built anymore by a developer.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I can certainly say we and the National Association of Home Builders have been advocating for a stronger federal role. Congress hasn't taken it up, and this has been sort of frustrating. The White House is listening more intently, I would say. Just a couple of weeks ago, we, the home builders and others, did have a meeting with the White House just on housing supply, where we talked about these issues, including what the federal government could do to lean in more on construction. These are also issues that we talked to the Federal Housing Finance Agency about in terms of what could the GSEs like Fannie and Freddie do to promote, to support more housing construction. I sometimes worry that this is going to be like one of those scenarios where it was like the frog in the pot that's boiling. It's like where people are going to realize too late just how the lack of housing supply is undermining not just affordability in America, but just overall stability. And also for renters, too. I don't want to leave that out because incomes are not keeping pace with rents in much of the country as well. And yeah, it's really going to fray at us. And so trade associations, who are on the front lines and seeing this have been pushing. And we're hearing, from the White House a recognition, but we're not seeing a whole lot of policy. We're seeing a bit from the Federal Housing Finance Agency, but not. It's a little too slow. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, I just would like to say thank you as a realtor to NAR for putting together the Fairhaven program. And I am looking forward to hearing that it will be updated and continued longer. Make it a better program, even better than it is. I actually wish that we would make it a requirement of licensing.
Thank you. It's always great to get a testimonial. Yeah, and we have just been bowled over by the response to it because, people have gone through a whole lot of training, and we expected, I don't know, maybe a more jaundiced view, but people have liked it. And now that I think it's been a hit, we can put more resources into it and maybe even make it a little fancier. So thanks.
You're very welcome.
Mm-hmm. Was there another question? Mm-hmm. Familiar face? Yeah, you've got a microphone
Hold
coming
on
to
one
you.
sec.
Just real quickly, we have a problem. Michigan, like many states, still doesn't cover source of income. And it's a real problem for low-income people on vouchers being unable to find housing. And we've had large apartment complexes going the other way, no longer renting to people with vouchers and that. And then it's also at the, comes to lending, sometimes sellers are reluctant or unwilling to lend to someone who's getting FHA financing or even VA financing. Do you or your office taken any steps, have any thoughts on what we could do in terms of source of income protection?
Yeah, so NAR is not taking a position on source of income to advocate for source of income as a prohibited basis under the federal law. I don't know where the Michigan realtors have been on this. What we have done is we have encouraged more voluntary use of vouchers, and we, as an association, have been advocating for more funding for housing choice vouchers, unlike other sort of entitlements in this country. Like, for example, if you qualify for food stamps, you automatically get food stamps. But if you qualify for housing choice vouchers, you don't. The shortfall is orders of magnitude in terms of the need. So we've been advocating aggressively for more vouchers. And then we've also been advocating for more mobility in the use of those vouchers. So I'm on the board of a new organization called Mobility Works, which is working with a number of fair housing advocates and others. There are fair housing advocates and others on this board who've been pushing for more money to help counsel people so they can use these vouchers in higher opportunity areas. So we've been pushing for those sorts of things and just calling more attention to the need for more vouchers and just the shortfall in terms of the need and the demand.
Any other questions? Comments?
Thank you, sir. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Maybe you're telling me to leave.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for being here today. We have the room until 10:30. I have no idea what time it is, but feel free to hang out and talk, and we'll keep Brian here until 10:30 if you want to say hello. All right, we'll see you next year at our 10th annual Fair Housing Breakfast. I also want to thank the Fair Housing Center staff for all the work they do to put this together. If you're on staff, raise your hand if you're on staff at the Fair Housing Center. All right, thank you very much.